Thank you so much, Mr. Ramos, for joining us on Policy Chat for the second time. You joined us last year to speak about crime prevention and criminal justice. But with the midterm elections coming up in less than a week, we thought it'd be a great opportunity to talk about one of the most discussed topics in 2022, the Supreme Court. It goes without saying that the Supreme Court is one of the most controversial and most discussed topics when it comes to the American political conversation. So before we dive super deep into the weeds of the conversation, I thought we can maybe start a little bit broad, so that we're all kind of on the same ground. Can you briefly overview the significance of the Supreme Court and why it's important for us as citizens to kind of be in the know of all of their rulings?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into too many details, but our forefathers were brilliant. Back in 1789, they were determining through our Constitution our power, our balance of power in the Constitution. And they created the separation of powers. One, of course, is the legislative, our Congress, our senators, and then the executive branch, of course, the president, the executive branch. And the last one they determined was the judicial branch because they thought, okay, legislators are going to make law. The executive branch is going to sign the law into law. But if there was a violation of the law or the Constitution by the executive branch or the legislative branch, well, who's going to determine that? So they created the judicial branch, and the highest level is the United States Supreme Court, which I think was brilliant back in the day and still holds true because those are still the same factors that we look at in when the United States Supreme Court takes a look at a case. It's most of the time has gone through the legislative part of our government, and sometimes, not all the times, through the executive branch. And then the United States Supreme Courts, of course, make a final determination. They are a huge part of our government. And as you see today, it does impact the public as well.
Amazing. Thank you for that little brief overview. I am going to segue kind of into a little bit of a more specific question. So polls indicate that the public views the Supreme Court more unfavorably than before. In your opinion, how significant is the public perception of the Supreme Court's legitimacy? And what are the consequences of a public not buying into or believing in the court's decisions?
Yeah. Most recently, I'd say, when I say recently, in the last 10 years, I don't recall ever seeing a nominee for the United States Supreme Court on primetime TV going through the Senate hearings and going through their background and some of the decisions they made. And then it's also become, whether we like it or not, political. A conservative background versus a liberal background. And it depends again on the President of the United States of America and the Senate in the confirmation hearings. It's become, I believe, in my time in law and justice, which is almost 40 years, way more political than I believe the forefathers ever thought the United States Supreme Court should be. Is that good or is that bad? One of the reasons they made United States Supreme Court justices life terms once they were appointed was they wouldn't have to worry about the politics about getting reelected or not. So they can make a decision with that without having to worry about the politics behind it. Now, in saying that, you are now seeing the justices making decisions where the public believes there is politics behind it. Roe versus Wade, huge decision about women's rights. Currently, affirmative action getting into colleges, Harvard Law School, and I think it was North Carolina, one of the Carolina schools brought an action that the Supreme Court heard argument over, and now they are deliberating on what they're going to determine whether or not you could use race as a factor to get into higher education. So with that, the public's perception is now, well, wait a minute. These are supposed to be justices determining whether something violates the Constitution of the United States. They shouldn't be putting their politics into it. That's one argument. The judges will tell you we do not. We look at the facts. We look at the Constitution of the United States. We look at what was the purpose of the law prior to it coming to the justices. And it's a very serious issue, because whatever the United States Supreme Court says and does, that's it. It's final. They're the highest court, I believe, not only in America, but in the world. If you think about some of the rulings they make and how it transcends across not only America, but internationally. So it's becoming more dynamic. The public is getting more and more concerned, but I think it's more concerned with the appointment process.
I think it's really interesting to talk about the politicization of the Supreme Court. And like you mentioned, there were mechanisms that were put in place from the beginning to prevent what's seemingly going on with the politicization. I did want to ask a follow-up on that, though. With the public being a lot more outspoken, for a variety of reasons, including, social media and advancements in technology, do you think that outspokenness may actually affect the decisions of Supreme Court justices in the future? Like, do you think there's a possibility that there may actually be some sort of back and forth? Is it possible that could happen? Or do you think because of the way the Supreme Court is built, that's just not really going to happen unless if there was some sort of, change in how the Supreme Court functions?
I think the Supreme Court, when they take their oath of office, is to really support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. And in doing that, they have to make their determination on the facts presented before them. There's oral argument. People might not realize, 100 to 150 cases a year that they review. Some of the big ones I just talked about, but not everybody hears about the others. And the public perception is something that is secondary, or people would hope to believe is secondary to their rulings. Now, that is why it's so important that you have the other branches, because if the public really is concerned about how the justices are ruling, right now, I think it's 6 conservatives to 3 more liberal justices, then you can elect a president that's going to, appoint justices. You can elect other senators. They're going to be part of that process, because they're not elected, but it's still, we have a voice. We can make determinations on whether or not the next Supreme Court justice is going to come from a very conservative background, or a liberal, or middle of the road. And I think that's important for the public to know, and it's important for the public to voice their opinion, because politicians listen. Look, in the last election, they were asking Biden and Trump, would you expand this, United States Supreme Court? And they were listening to the public. And term limits in the Supreme Court. People don't know this, but I was doing some research. 3/4 of Americans think there should be term limits of a Supreme Court justice, or an age limit. 70 years old. There isn't an age limit for the President of the United States. So how do you argue that?
It's really interesting. And I've heard like other, the term limit point, I've also heard be applied to like Congress members or senators as well. I think I read a statistic one time that was like 88% or close to 90, which is, an astounding statistic. You rarely find any that level of agreement. But on that point, another conversation that I've heard spoken about a lot in the past few years is on expanding the court. Is this feasible? And maybe some of the other, options that you spoke about, term limits and maybe other changes, how feasible are they? Or are they just kind of, wishful thinking?
You know, I've looked at that, and I've heard the arguments, and you should know that when the court started in 1789, there were only 6 justices. And then they added another one in 180. Nope, actually, they took one off down to 5, and early 1800s back to 7. And it was 1869 where you have 9. And that's where it stayed. Which you better have an odd number, because you've got to have somebody that's going to break the tie if that's going to happen. So the pros to having 9, it's been established. There's a precedent that says 9 justices is what we've had in the history of our country, for the majority part of our country, and the rulings that they've made, if you look at them in a totality, that have been supporting the Constitution of the United States of America, no matter what side put them into office. The pro is, well, wait a minute, it's becoming so partisan. Why don't we expand it? Well, the argument against that too, and I understand that, expand it to what? Some people say you have 12 jurors. Why don't we have 12? But then again, you better have 13 or 11 so you can have a break in the tie. And then how does that fix the problem? Because we have an election coming up. If Joe Biden or another Democrat doesn't win, you've got a Republican, whether it's Trump or some other Republican. So they're going to be able to stack the court. And so is the other way around. So I don't think it's numbers that's going to work. Of course, that's my humble opinion and a lot of opinions. But the opinion that's out there, like I said before, is term limits. Then you have your 9 justices. And when they reach a certain age, then they respectfully retire. And then you have an opportunity to appoint another justice. But if you do that, my argument is, okay, there should be term limits on all the federal judges, because all federal judges, the appellate judges on down, they have lifetime terms. And they can sit there and they could be judges until their last days. So I think that's a better approach.
You have discussed a little bit about like elections and how the court ultimately like goes down to like the elections and sorry. But in short,
Yeah.
we just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you think the midterm elections that are happening, right around the corner, how significant do you think the Supreme Court rulings will play in voting behavior, especially since you mentioned how the rulings in the past have gotten a lot of public opinion lately?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because a lot of the times in midterm elections, the Supreme Court has nothing to do with them. Not this time. You have 2 major issues that they are looking at. One is Roe versus Wade. Now, we all saw what happened when they made that determination, when they came up with their analysis and taking away the rights of women. That really fired up the public, especially the public your age, the young voters from 18 through, I'll say, 25 to maybe even 30. There were rallies across America, and that really got people out. It's sad to say now that the economy and other things, issues are coming back to play with all the talk of recession. And people are hoping that the public, especially the young voters, they're probably going to determine who the next legislators, Congresses, senators are, and the next president. Because you got older voters like me, we vote all the time. But you got a group of young people like yourselves that are going to be the future leaders that are could really make a determination. Now, if they sit at home and they don't vote, well, then we may just have status quo. So it'll be interesting to me to see if that same energy after the decision on Roe versus Wade comes out in the ballot box. And that's a week away. If it does, then that tells you that the decision by the United States Supreme Court lit a fire under the public, under the citizens of the United States of America, and people are paying attention. And that's a good thing. People should pay attention to what's going on with their legislative leaders, executive leaders, and now the United States Supreme Court, of the like I said, the top court in the world, in my opinion.
I think that's a really good point. And it's really interesting to think about how, if, like you said, if, next Tuesday, if it seems like there was an increase in voter turnout, and it seems like that might be because of what happened this year in the Dobbs decision on overturning Roe v. Wade, that would be really fascinating. But on the other hand, like you mentioned, if that isn't the case, that really brings the question, what can be done when it comes to actually getting young people, specifically like you talked about, getting them to vote. Because if the decisions the Supreme Court made this year don't light that fire, it really sparks an interesting conversation on why people aren't voting and what's causing that. And another point that I thought about while you were speaking on specifically young people voting is social media and the role it plays. I think it's so interesting to talk about social media when it comes to the politicization of the court, and also just public opinion and perception, because you find that, there are a lot of echo chambers on, various platforms, a lot of people, spewing misinformation or maybe twisting the words of elected officials or maybe even the justices. Do you think there's any role that social media and maybe even traditional media and how that's changed in the last decade or so? What role does that play when it comes to the public's perception of the Supreme Court? Because I also think, while talking about how the politicization of the court is, definitely a negative, I think it's also important to recognize, the court has made some historically really significant decisions in the past that were really beneficial. And so, like the end of segregation with Brown, that was one of the most that's like one of the highlights of the court's decisions. And so it's so difficult to, to kind of balance that out. So what are your thoughts on when it comes to the, the social media and media aspect of this conversation?
Well, there's no doubt about it that social media has changed the whole dynamics of the world of how they see things. For example, the leak of the Roe versus Wade documents prior to them making a decision, that was sent through media. That wouldn't have happened before in the Brown versus the Board of Education and whatnot. Social media is something that we need to really take a look at. It can be a powerful tool for public and information and young voters to get out. It can also really be a tool to manipulate. One of the things I teach a law and justice course there at UCR, and we looked at social media and the determinations they made regarding the criminal justice system. And most people believe what they see on TV or what they see on Twitter or what they see on Facebook. And I challenged the students and we looked at what the facts were in reality compared to a real case and the facts that you don't get on social media. Remember, social media too, news, TV, they're sound bites, bam, less than 30 seconds. So my challenge to the students and my challenge to young voters is, yes, use social media, but do some research. I mean, there's a thing called Google. It's even I can use that. And you can really break down what the issues are and where people stand, including the United States Supreme Court. You can go there and look at the cases that they're reviewing, et cetera. And you can look at the backgrounds of Supreme Court justices, et cetera. So social media is going to be part of it from now on. I think it's good use if it's used properly to drive out our young voters. It's to me that's so important for our country because our country's getting older. We're the aged America now. The young folks are coming up, and you really, it's your time to start making decisions on where you want this country to go. Whether it's the United States Supreme Court, the president, legislation, your local city, council members, your school board members. It's so important. I think that's one of the most important rights we have, is the right to vote.
Absolutely. And kind of to like bounce off of what Kevin was saying as well, the whole idea now that social media is the most popular form of platform for young students like our age and similar to that. With that also does come a big responsibility of elected officials are now on these social media platforms, and now they also have more of a bigger platform to speak and speak out about their opinions. So we wanted to hear a little bit about your opinion on how you think how you feel about elected officials speaking out on justices on these platforms.
Yeah, it's a platform, and if it reaches voters, you reach it. When I was the elected DA, I had a Twitter account. I still have a Twitter account. If you want to go join it, at Michael Ramos, come on aboard. It's different issues now, but we used it to. I used to use it to talk about human trafficking and the issues that we had before, to wake up people. This is really happening here. We used it to warn people. I know my good friend, the DA in Riverside County, Mike Hestrin, is warning the public on Twitter about fentanyl and the drugs and what it's doing to our young people, to be careful. I think it's a great tool if it's used right. I get concerned about people using it to put up conspiracy theories and those kinds of things, to one way or another, one party or another, to really attack people with false allegations, and it's used for that too. And there should be a better, I think, laws to control that. But there's a law out there that if the owners of Facebook or Twitter aren't responsible for the comments that are made, you can't sue them. So it's really difficult to control that conversation. But I truly believe that overall, it's a positive way to get your message out as an elected official. So you, the voter, can make a determination on how to vote. And it's also a way to get information, like we're doing today, about a branch of government in the United States Supreme Court.
And then as you were speaking about it, and obviously speaking about how, like, everything about the benefits of having a platform like this, I can't help but think that sometimes if I'm scrolling through Twitter, for example, and I see a government official speaking out about an injustice, do you think this creates a divide in the politics? Do you think it also increases like the population kind of going and disagreeing with the Supreme Court decision?
I think it does. I think in a healthy way, though. I think it allows people then to really give their both sides, and if they're doing it the appropriate way, you'll get responses. I used to get responses too on people that support a position that you have, people that are against a position, like we talk about every day. And I think that's a good way to break down the law you're talking about, the opinion by the United States Supreme Court. Let's talk about that. How do people really feel about it in a very professional manner? Now, there's some people out there that are way out there and they go on attack mode, which we're seeing more and more in our country, which is very sad, especially with what happened to Nancy Pelosi's husband. But in saying that, back to your question, I think it's a good way for people to have a dialogue. Otherwise, how are you going to have a dialogue with an elected official, unless you make an appointment to see that person? And of course, they're swamped, especially at the congressional level.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ramos. I did want to circle back to the Supreme Court for another question. We talked a bit about the midterms and the impact that there may or may not have on voters on whether or not they turn out based on the court's decisions this last year. But I also did want to ask, from the other perspective, you mentioned earlier on how Supreme Court justices, once they get appointed, it's almost impossible for them to get out. I know there are, other cases or unique scenarios, but for the most part, there's really, nothing preventing them from staying in that position, like you said, until the end of their days. So, from their perspective, and this is probably a difficult question, but from their perspective, what do you think justices or even other, lower courts and the judges that serve on those courts, what do you think their thinking when it comes to the backlashes they see. Because I also recall after the overturning of Roe, there was Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was talking about taking a look at other past decisions and potentially overturning those. And, that brings us to the question of things like, judicial activism. Is this going beyond the scope of the court? What are your thoughts on their, the perspective of a judge or a justice when it comes to, this entire conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you, let me answer the first part of it. The way they have life terms, but like the president, you can remove a United States Supreme Court justice through impeachment process. It's rare. There's only been a handful from appellate federal judges to the United States Supreme Court in the history of our country. But there is a process, but it's very rare. So the judges feel like they are protected and can't be attacked politically when they're making their decisions. That's the positive side of it, because we don't want judges to be making decisions on the fact that I better make a decision for this business guy because he gave me, $50,000 to get reelected. If they were elected and put in that position, and if I go against him, he's going to come after me and take me out. And that happens to other elected officials that aren't judges. Now, my concern, and I think the public's concern, is judicial activism, the justices crossing the line to, the political world, to the legislative world. And it's no secret that one of the concerns is Justice Thomas, by the way, the oldest justice, 74 years old. His wife is very involved politically on the left-hand side and has been part of nonprofits, etc. And when Justice Thomas made that statement, it concerned me as a citizen of the United States of America. What is he doing here? Is his wife going to drive the agenda? And if I was a citizen of the United States, I would be concerned about that. So that's a rare occasion where I've had that concern. And perhaps I'm overreacting, but what I'm reading from the general public, as you indicated, and we talked about before, they're starting to have concerns about the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, definitely. In a lot of ways this year or these past couple of years have been so fascinating ever since COVID started. It seems like the country has gone through a roller coaster that, when you think it's going to end, it's just something else happens and you realize it hasn't ended. It's really fascinating. To conclude here, Mr. Ramos, I wanted to ask, and I know you kind of already talked about this, but I thought it'd be good to end on as well. With midterms coming up this Tuesday, or next Tuesday, I should say. We talked about, the importance of voting, especially for young people. If you could, if someone gave you 30 seconds or 1 minute to give a brief message to people, when it comes to the, everything that's happened in the country, in regards to voting, what would you say?
Oh, my goodness. What I would say is this is an awesome country we live in. And if we want to keep it that way, you need to vote. You need to vote and make sure that the right people are put in office to protect our rights under the Constitution of the United States of America. All of our rights, no matter what color, what background, what race. We are all one American. And the only way to ensure that is to vote. You may think your vote doesn't count, but it does. Every vote, from down to a local school board race to the United States president, is key to our society continuing to be what we are in the world. And if you look at other worlds and if you look at the world in other countries and the problems they have, it comes down to apathy and not voting, etc. Voting is key. It's a right we have, one of the first right, I truly believe, and our country is better for it. And now with you young students coming through, I think it's a great opportunity to really drive what you want this country to continue to be.
I think that's the perfect note to end on with midterms
Sure.
just days away. Mr. Ramos, thank you so much for taking the time
Thank
to
you.
join us for the second time on Policy Chats. This was such an amazing topic that we've actually never covered on Policy Chats. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you again. I did too.
Mr. Ramos.